All right, time to move up that family tree. We're heading into what's considered macrosociology today. So looking at society as a whole, so large groups. First person we need to talk about is Emil Durkheim, okay? Not Emily, but Emil. Emil studies the bonds that hold people together. He holds a functionalist view of society, and his biggest credit is really given to the studies that he does. He believed that we had to study what was directly observable, okay, using that scientific study, not making any assumptions or accusations, okay, but what you can actually see. He was really concerned with the problem of social order. And so with that, he studied how the bonds in different societies lead to different actions or consequences. One of his first studies was the division of labor in society in 1893, and studied that industrial societies, the bonds were really based on tasks, whereas in agrarian society, the bonds in society were really based on shared traditions and beliefs. He is one of the first to complete a scientific study for sociology, and so therefore created a more legitimate field of study. The study that he's most famous for is in 1897, his study on suicide. He looked at statistical data about how suicide was related to societal factors, religion, marital status, employment, and explained how suicide was impacted, that a very personal decision like suicide was impacted by the society that the person was experiencing. He believed that explaining suicide by focusing exclusively on the victim's psychological makeup neglected the impact of the bonds in that society. While he was studying different European communities, he found that societies where bonds were looser, typically more urban societies, there were higher suicide rates than in agrarian societies where the bonds were a little bit more strong. Building on his work, oops, wrong direction, was Talcott Parsons. He took this a little bit more clarified the functionalist perspective a little bit more, emphasizing the function of social institutions. And this is something we're going to talk more in outcome 2. But social institutions are things like religion, education, government, family, economics would be another one. And he believed that in order for a society to be successful, social cohesion was key. So these different social institutions had to work together. Families and religion, education, government, they all had to support one another with specific tasks. Building on that is Robert Merton, who studies sociology from a functionalist perspective, this time looking at those same social institutions that Parsons studied, but looking at what are some manifest functions of those institutions and what are some latent functions of those institutions. A manifest function is intended, so religion provides a set of guidelines for how one lives its life. Government is supposed to protect their people. Family is supposed to provide economic or emotional security. Those are all intended functions. Latent functions are things that are unintended. Things like religion could create distrust or dislike between those who do not believe the same thing. Education could lead to conformity and stifle creativity. Those are not intended functions, but they are things that are happening. Also, an example of macrosociology, so studying broad subjects and large groups, is Karl Marx. But this time, instead of having a functionalist perspective, Marx introduces us to something called the conflict perspective. Marx was concerned with how the structure of society was influenced by its economy, mostly focused on the growth of capitalism. He looked specifically at the class conflict ongoing between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, you might remember from world history, are the rich, okay? They own the production methods, the land, the resources, and the proletariat, which was the working class. He focused on how dominance, competition, and social change all impacted society. Knowing that resources are limited, Marx believed that it was human nature for one group to take advantage of another group. And in order for societies to change, there had to be a large amount of conflict. W.E.B. Du Bois, somebody you might remember from U.S. history, also a conflict theorist. He studies how inequalities related to race and ethnicity impacted American society. He focused on the causes and consequences of prejudice and discrimination. Where you may have studied W.E.B. Du Bois is maybe building on his ideas as we're heading into the civil rights movement. Also a conflict theorist, okay, this time looking at kind of an offshoot, the feminist theory, right, would be Judith Butler, the woman on the left, and Catherine McKinnon, the woman on the right. Both of these women look at how gender inequality based on power and prestige impacts society. And one more in the conflict theory, which would be Marjorie Garber. Marjorie Garber focuses more on sexuality, so she builds on what's called the queer theory. She believes that there's no sexual category that is either fundamentally deviant or normal. She also takes it a step further that the categories that we put people in are really no longer relevant, that our identity is fluid, meaning constantly changing throughout our lifetimes. These sociologists make up our macrosociologists. So you had your functionalists in the beginning, our first three, right, and our last four building on the conflict theory. Those theories you're going to talk more about in the next component. For this component, you are held accountable for who are these people and what is their key contribution to sociology.